I'm Bill Long. I'm the Executive Vice President of Government Affairs for MEMA. And I also serve as the President Chief Operating Officer for one of MEMA's 4 divisions, the Automotive Aftermarket Suppliers Association. For those of you who are in town for the NAFTA talks this week, welcome to Washington, D.C. And welcome to all of you to MEMA's 3rd event and policy briefing series, this one titled A World Without NAFTA, a look at the future through the lens of the automotive industry. You know, there is little doubt the changes the Trump administration will propose for NAFTA's rules of origin and other trade rules will profoundly affect the automotive industry. As you know, President Trump has also kept on the table the option of pulling out of NAFTA completely. Today, we'll explore the direct and real-world impacts of those potential changes. You know, since before the inauguration day and every day since, MEMA, a leading trade association in the mobility industry, has been working closely with the Trump administration and with policymakers and legislators to ensure that they are aware of and understand the issues critical to the motor vehicle industry. You know, some of you may not know that vehicle component suppliers, MEMA members, represent the largest sector of manufacturing jobs in the United States, contributing nearly 3% of U.S. gross domestic product and directly employing more than 871,000 Americans. And as impressive as that is, this is also an increase of 19% in jobs since 2012. Ensuring America stays competitive will help continue that job growth. Yet U.S. vehicle manufacturers, to remain at the forefront, must make sure the NAFTA modernization discussions and outcome is done right. And hopefully, today's discussion will help us do just that. We have a stellar panel this morning to help us imagine a world without NAFTA and what it might look like to the automotive industry. But first, we'll begin with a short presentation from our friend Xavier Mosquet with the Boston Consulting Group.
So what I will do is to share with you, a few of the results of work that MEMA has asked the Boston Consulting Group, to gather. So we've done a few, fact-finding and analysis around NAFTA specific to the automotive industry. So I'll go through a short summary, and then I'll use some of the charts you have in front of you. But whether you have them or not, I think that you'll get the message clearly. The few things we looked at is, first of all, what has been the impact on NAFTA overall, independently of the automotive industry, on the overall GDP of the U.S. And there's been, basically 15 studies that have been done around this topic, since NAFTA's inception. And the result of most of these studies is that actually the impact on U.S. GDP has been positive. The figures, vary between $20 billion and $100 billion, since NAFTA's inception. So overall, the one thing we can say is it has benefited the overall U.S. economy, and notably with one principle, which is we all know that productivity is critical to wealth and GDP growth, and NAFTA has benefited to the U.S. productivity. By the way, you should know that if you look at all free trade agreements, and there's been studies around the world on those topics, typically the figure that comes out is 0.5% of positive impact on the countries that have put in place free trade agreements. The next thing which I think is important for all of us is if we look, since the recession, since 2008, basically the job growth in the automotive industry in the U.S. Have been about the same as overall NAFTA. So basically, the U.S. has grown about 6%, NAFTA overall has grown about 7%, but roughly we all benefited from a better economic landscape. It's not one or the other that would have taken the bigger share. The third thing that's critical is, I think what our industry has, been penalized for is competitiveness. We've all gone through those, 30, 40 years of slow decline of the U.S. automotive industry, compared to other global players. And frankly, if I look at this business, the key thing is to keep it competitive against other, big automotive geographies. And the two other ones are actually Germany and Japan. What's interesting is if you look at both, Germany and Japan, they all have, in a way, their low-cost source of parts to be competitive globally. And we'll see, by the way, that the US, within NAFTA, basically has the same share of low-cost labor sources in its product, and so that has been part of us being globally competitive. But at the same time, they found different ways, to be able to be exporters in that industry, and they haven't done that, through tariff systems. They've actually done that through defining areas where they have invested in technology and basically developed a unique competitive advantage. And I think if there is something that we want to do to continue growing that industry, is basically to invest in technologies. And we have a number of areas where the US, being electrification or being autonomous, where the US has specific advantages. And what we should be doing is basically continue to push in those technological investments and give an incentive to our companies to be leaders in those areas. If we look at the changes that are currently, and again, it's only still rumors and not proposals, around the rules of origins and potentially changes in tariff shifting, our analysis would show that it could impact as much as 24,000 jobs in the US. So it's extremely difficult to find any positive job impact in the sense that what is being proposed is unlikely to change the decisions that car manufacturers and suppliers will make in terms of their footprint. So it will not recreate jobs, but it will actually increase the cost of the products on the US grounds. And our experience is that when this happens, people start making trade-offs about how much content they buy. And if they start reducing content, it will impact the features. And the features are only supplier jobs and they're US jobs. And so up to 24,000 jobs, given our calculations, could be impacted, could be actually lost if we start increasing the cost of the products. And so, as I said, I think modernizing NAFTA is certainly a great objective. Helping the U.S. industry to be even more competitive and define specific areas, for skill set that can be globally defendable, should actually be the objective. There is a very, complex, in a way, set of supply chain organization that have been put in place by all the car manufacturers and suppliers, and specifically the US ones, to be competitive globally. Basically sourcing parts, where they have, plants and scale, where they have the right suppliers, and organizing and investing in all these plants. Making changes around that, will be costly for the industry as a whole, in the sense that, if people want to make, location changes based on that, they will basically have to reinvest, and this will be basically money that will not be invested in growth, it will just be invested in restructuring. And so we have to be slightly careful about that. And by the way, if I look also at the supply chain, Mexico is definitely a net importer to the US, we all know that. But as I said, it has had a lot of positive impact. If we look at Canada, for instance, it's basically a neutral balance. Our trade with Canada, but in general, is about the same. The page I would like to spend a minute on is page 13, which basically just compares the US and Germany in terms of, what amount of parts are imported in a given car. And you will see that, in the US, we import roughly $5,500 of parts per car. In Germany, actually, it is a bit higher. It is $6,300 per car that are imported. And roughly, just to make it very simple, half of those come from low labor cost countries. It's the same in Germany, and Germany is leveraging extensively Eastern Europe. We have that 50% in the US. And if you look at that 50%, half of that comes from Mexico. And so, in a way, our global competitiveness, depends a lot on having access, for parts that are harder to manufacture in the US, have access to these areas. If it's not Mexico, I would say, the industry to be competitive will have to find other places. And are there better places? I don't think so, because the good value of Mexico for the US is it's close, and therefore the logistics are quite attractive. This is why, by the way, Germany has invested so much in Eastern Europe. You'd see the same figures for Japan. They also have roughly the same amount of low-cost parts that have been purchased. So Germany and Japan actually have a positive, so they have the low-cost sources, but they also have a positive, trade balance in automotive. And again, if you look at it carefully, it's because they have defined areas where it has to compete with them. And I think, we have leaders in technology in the US, both on the supplier side and the OEM side. And if we want, to grow our jobs and then be next exporters, we just have to be at the forefront of technology. Which, by the way, in passing, means that we need to have regulations that are tight enough so that there is an incentive to continue pushing technologies. The worst we could do is to basically allow our industry to be technology complacent. That would be, for sure, within 10 years, a loss of jobs overall. This is the math that we did with 80%, which is, some of the figures that are being floated, 80% rules of origin versus the 62.5% that we're using today, and 40% domestic content, where we have today within NAFTA no rules of domestic content. The net impact, if we look at what would be how OEMs and suppliers comply with those rules, and nobody obviously complies today with 80% NAFTA content and 40% domestic content. And therefore, on those parts and cars that would not comply, there would be an added tariff. And we took today the WTO automotive tariff, which is 2.5%. And the impact on both Mexico and Canada globally will mean an increase in cost per car that we think would translate into 24,000 job losses. And we can go into more detail later in the calculation if you want. I think I will stop that for now, and maybe then open to Anne and to our panel discussion. Thank you.
So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of you who've come. I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but let's just start on a press report, and I think some of the people in this room were also at the event. Last night, Secretary Ross said again, something that was repeated in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago, that his analysis is that the content for U.S. vehicles is going down. But at the same time, as Xavier mentioned, and we've all seen, our manufacturing jobs have gone up in this country as suppliers. Manufacturing of vehicles themselves have gone up and at an all-time high. How do y'all square that? How do you square what the Secretary is saying with what we see as an industry that's growing, that we're very pleased with both the job growth and the production and the manufacturing growth in this country itself, not just North America, but in the United States?
Sure, happy to start. And I think one of the issues with the change with domestic content and the growth that we've been experiencing over the last several years, and for us, it's been the last 25 years, is our ability to invest and to continue investing. What we've seen, as Bill pointed out in his opening comments, a growth of jobs at 19%. Continental's growth in that same time period has been more than 40%, something that we would like to continue, though we see with some of the proposals meeting those numbers would be a very difficult task and something that we would potentially have to sacrifice is our continued growth.
One of the things that we did as soon as we saw the Ross op-ed in the Washington Post was to take a look at what seemed to us to be numbers that were just extremely low and heading in the wrong direction. He has indicated that the OECD data and that the work that was done by a study that was done at Commerce Department indicated that there was a reduction in U.S. content in vehicles produced in Mexico. So we did our own analysis. And looking at it, it just our analysis shows that the actual domestic U.S. content in vehicles produced in Mexico has been at a steady state. It has not declined. And in fact, if you look at over the period of the last 16 years, U.S. exports of auto parts to Mexico have gone up faster than the production in Mexico. So therefore, the content would clearly have gone up instead of down. So we're not sure why the data at the OECD has shown that this has been a decrease, but it clearly belies sort of basic fundamental data that we have that based on production and based on U.S. trade. It just shows a completely different pattern. It shows a pattern of a steady state around about 30% or above U.S. content of the vehicles produced in Mexico, as opposed to the numbers that they're talking about, which have gone from about 30% down to, I think the claim is down to 18% in 2011, and actually trajectory on a trend line would go down to 12% this year or last year. So, I think the OECD data, global trade data analysis can be a bit misleading, especially when you get down to a sector-specific level. And I think that there's something fundamentally off with the OECD data. And I think clearly our data is much more consistent with what the experience of the auto industry has been in the United States and North America in general.
Well, I think as well that the data has ended in 2011. When we were coming off a very difficult time in the automotive industry, and there's been a real resurgence since then as well. So relying on data that's that old is also a problem.
Absolutely. The data being 6 years old is clearly a problem, and the fact that it ends right around and very close to the proximity of a 50% reduction in U.S. 50% reduction in U.S. production in the United States. There was obviously a very steep drop during the 2008-2009 period. So having data end around 2011, when the recovery hasn't fully taken shape in the U.S. and the auto sector, is clearly an issue as well.
Do you know why their data is so outdated, or they only do it every 5 years? Or?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I imagine that I don't know the answer to that. What the reason is for that? But clearly, having me 6 years out of whack is a problem. And the idea that with Mexican production having gone up, but U.S. exports to Mexico having gone up faster than that, just belies the idea that there would be a reduction in content. You just do the math. It's pretty simple, straightforward.
Xavier, did you want to add anything?
No, I think the one thing I would say is, for me, the most important to create jobs is competitiveness. And I think, the industry needs lots of different tools, including labor and technology, to be able to gain that competitiveness. And if I look back, I think, what has hurt the U.S. auto industry until 2008, is the fact that it was not playing, with enough of the competitiveness levers. And since then, I think we have regained tremendous, quality, financial health, and recreated lots of jobs. I think we need to continue on that track.
So one of the things that I hear a lot, and I'm sure all of you do too, and many of the members of the press here have posed this question to me, is we talk about why NAFTA has been good for the industry. But there's a feeling among Americans that it hasn't been good for the American public. I mean, Ian, you mentioned a little bit, and Xavier, I think you mentioned it too, of the number of jobs that we continue to create. Can you expand on that a little bit? And then I guess the other part of this question is, then what do we see if NAFTA dissolves in some way or becomes unusable for the industry? How will that affect jobs? And how would that affect an American community that might have seen growth overall because of supplier jobs?
Well, I'll tell you that some of the benefits of what NAFTA has done for a company like Continental goes beyond simple numbers. The benefits that we have seen obviously increase our ability to serve our customers, to grow our bottom line, to increase jobs. But what it has really allowed us to do is expand our knowledge on a regional basis on how best to improve our supply chains and our manufacturers and serving our customers. Understanding how to use employment to the best of our ability in various regions. One of the great things that we've done that has been expressed highly with this administration is expanding work with internships and apprenticeships, and being able to bring folks from other regions and other countries to learn some of the manufacturing practices that we believe we've tackled here in the U.S., and also learning from other cultures. And again, I go back to the serving our customers, which ultimately ends with delivering a quality product to the end consumer at a valuable price.
Xavier, you want to talk a little bit about what you see as sort of the benefit? I mean, we all take it for granted that people understand the benefit of the auto industry for communities, but can we expand on that a little bit, and what might happen if a manufacturing industry like the auto industry has additional costs, is no longer globally competitive, what can a U.S. community or U.S. worker who might not be thinking about autos see in their future?
Yeah. I think one of the things that the industry overall is fighting with, but especially in the U.S., is just the increasing content of vehicles. And the price of vehicle actually has increased significantly just because, there's more regulation, consumer wants more into it. Until a point where, if we don't continue to be productive in that industry, at some point, consumers will just not be able to afford the cars. And if I look at the next frontier, which is the one that has the biggest benefit, for the consumers and the society as a whole, it's about first of all cleanliness and reducing emissions, so electrification, and it's about safety. The next thing that people are buying today is safety features. The one that have those automatic emergency braking and so on, and some work we've done in the past show that if you increase those features, you can reduce the number of accidents on U.S. roads by 30%. This has been the last thing that people have started to spend on. If we start to increase the product cost again, this is the first thing that will go away. And so basically, if you look at the value for society, we're reducing content, we're reducing jobs, and then we're taking safety away.
Yeah, in terms of, NAFTA brings scale, it brings competitiveness, it brings efficiencies, synergies, among the three countries, and it brings duty-free trade, which actually, when you do the quick calculation of the tariff and the actual volume of trade, it's about $10 billion a year that is saved by having NAFTA in place. So, if we create a situation where the rule of origin is impossible to meet, or NAFTA goes away, it's essentially a $10 billion add. It's basically a $10 billion tax on the auto industry in North America.
So in talking about free global competitiveness, let's talk a little bit about the reliance of our industry on free trade agreements. I think the things that's concerning to me as we look more and more of an internal look rather than how do we strengthen our free trade agreements. We talked a little bit about Germany and Japan, but how do we see our ability to compete globally if we are no longer able to work as a North American supply chain?
I'll answer that first real quick. I think what you'll do is you would disincentivize investment in the U.S. If you look at Mexico as an example, Mexico has all these free trade agreements, including with Europe and with Japan. It puts them in a very powerful position in terms of being able to attract investment so that they can actually sell not just to the U.S., but to Europe and Japan and other markets around the world. And a situation where free trade agreements are limited, or we back out of free trade agreements, are going to create a dynamic where we are going to disincentivize investment in the U.S. for markets around the world and incentivize other markets that have free trade agreements like Mexico.
But to hit on Charles's point, it's exactly the way that companies like Continental are viewing the proposals that are being put on the table is where do we see ourselves moving forward? And in terms of the investment in the United States, such as Continental, which has invested well over $5 billion in the last 5 years into the U.S. marketplace, it's unlikely that trend will continue given the rise in cost of manufacturing that will go up given if some of these proposals are enacted. Xavier pointed out in his last comments about the availability to get certain products to the end consumer, such as safety and fuel efficiency. We see that the increase of electronic and electrification of vehicles, and that's not just in the engines, but also in the brake systems and the computing systems and the infotainment systems, will be put at extreme risk if NAFTA is withdrawn, or if things such as, simply as the tariff shift principle is eliminated from the NAFTA free trade agreement. Our availability to get the necessary electronics into a vehicle will be made much more expensive, and so much so that we potentially would have to look at other regions to manufacture certain parts and components.
When you look at the the U.S. auto industry, 20% of the production in the United States gets exported. Half of that, and that's about 2 million vehicles, half of that goes to Canada and Mexico. So if we look at a situation where we're unable to export duty-free to Mexico and Canada, by the way, two markets which our products do extremely well, it's going to have a huge negative impact on our ability to export those vehicles and our ability to capitalize on those markets that our brands are very popular in.
So let's talk about tariff shifts, since it's something that keeps me up at night dreaming about tariff shifts. So I just want to spread the joy in the room, so to speak. The administration has characterized tariff shifts as a loophole. And they view this as a way that we get around having U.S. content. It might be helpful for those in the room, and I know many of you are in the auto industry, but to understand how these components are put together and what really happens at a supplier facility in the United States or Mexico in adding value. I mean, and I know I'm supposed to be the moderator, but I'll take the pulpit for a minute. Tariff shifts are when you can add actual labor to it and you shift what the product is. And so the content can actually be the labor that's involved. And that creates U.S. jobs. I mean, that is one of the reasons why U.S. jobs in the supplier industry are up. But, I mean, let's talk a little bit about that. Do we see this really as a loophole, or how does this value add help the U.S. economy?
We don't view it as a loophole at all. And you made a great point in that a company like Continental and some of the systems that we manufacture, we do not manufacture a system from the beginning to the end. We rely upon suppliers ourselves. And some of the content that goes into these systems, we have to purchase from suppliers. Some of the electronics that we purchase are protected under the ITA, the Information Technology Act, which is a WTO past agreement. And those electronics can come into the region duty-free. We take those and then take them to a plant, say in North Carolina, and add some labor and some additional products that we do manufacture and come up with a finished good that we end up selling to our customer. We were able to move those products across lines into Mexico and back into the United States several times duty-free under NAFTA. Taking away tariff shift would add a greater increased cost to those systems that we end up selling to our customers, who then would potentially pass those costs along to the end consumer. So eliminating that tariff shift, while the components inside of the system do not change, the overall impact that it has on the end consumer will change, and that's in the form of cost.
So, Xavier, you mentioned, tariff shifts and the different things that we've all read in publications about what might be on the page. And I just wanted to reassert the number we're looking at for jobs, and obviously we're dealing with sort of an unknown of where the landing zone may be on this. But looking at what Ian just said, we're talking about supplier jobs that could be lost, right? This is not counting vehicle manufacturer jobs or dealer jobs or other industry jobs. I mean, we always say that every one of our jobs creates another 5 jobs. Can you talk about how you looked at that and looked at just at suppliers, just to make sure that everybody's clear about a potential job loss number?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of things that are happening there. So first of all, if the logic is that, consumers, start to decontent what they buy, just because of the increase in the product costs that have been passed in the end to the end consumer, the thing that it takes out is features. It doesn't take out units produced, so it's not about assembly, but it's really about, the feature that all suppliers are producing for the OEMs. And so all those jobs, will definitely, be, as you said, supplier jobs that are, typically higher technology. We're talking about safety and things like that, which are, U.S. jobs, not Mexican jobs. Because, obviously, by, in a way, optimizing the supply chain, depending on labor costs, what the U.S. is doing is basically, reinvesting into, more technological, advanced, features and designs, and therefore, in a way, creating, higher paid, manufacturing jobs in the U.S. This is the way it happens. And these are the ones that actually, would be lost. And obviously, every time there is, one supplier job, it increases, all the retail margins that are developed after that. So if you're, a dealer, you leave on those options features that you're able to sell, and all these margins, goes away. So there will be a ripple effect, beyond just the raw supplier job that we calculated. The other thing I'd like to say is, tariff shifting, as Ian said, is a risky mechanism in the sense that, some parts actually do, cross the border 5 or 6 times in the course of a product manufacturing between the US and Mexico or the US and Canada. And the ability to track, all these things, we do it, when we want a sample, we take 2 weeks to track that part, back and forth, being, small costs, bought in the US, shipped to Mexico, integrated in something else, shipped back to the US and back to Mexico for an assembly. Now, there's most likely no way we can track all of that if we, wanted to. And therefore, eliminating the tariff shifting is not only a cost issue, it's a pure operational issue. And we may just not be able to do that. And therefore, it basically stops the ability to produce a car. And so we have to be really careful about those simple words which say, okay, let's just get rid of it. But I think operationally, because that industry has become so well optimized, it may just be possible. And even if you're buying a part that is 10 cents and you want to add 10 cents of cost to it just because of administrative tracing, basically you're doubling the cost of the product. Because those parts that go back and forth are clearly small parts where there aren't many manufacturers, which are reasonably cheap, and any administrative cost actually is going to make a big difference on the cost of the final product.
So Xavier, when you and I started talking about different issues at the beginning of the year, I know that you did an analysis of the Chinese parts that are coming into Mexico. There's been a lot of press and concern that there's a rising cost, but your analysis didn't show that. They showed an increase, but not I would say not a flood. I think it's about 5% of the parts that are coming into Mexico are from China. So it's not an expansive concern or challenge that we see.
No, I think Mexico has not been a way for, I would say, global suppliers and manufacturers to find an entry into the U.S. I mean, there's been a bit of that, but basically it's mainly for manufacturing optimization. I.e., when I produce a part as a supplier in China, and I have a plan for that, I mean, there's no reason to rebuild another plant somewhere else, especially in Mexico, and so you just take it from where you manufacture it. But in terms of percentages, as you said, it's extremely low. And by the way, I'd like us to think about, the impact of having a low-cost manufacturer close to us. Because, on some of those parts that are manufactured in Mexico, we're talking about 5 to 10% logistics cost. If they're coming from anywhere further, again, we're losing everything. So we're just, paying more just for transportation. And I think there's a huge value, and this is, I think, what Europe and Germany have found very early on, that there was far more value for them to invest in Eastern Europe than to invest in China. And I think, Mexico for us is a good way, in a way to keep jobs close to us where we can all benefit from the economic growth. And putting it further, and it happened, you remember probably that, 10, 15 years ago, there was a big war in Mexico that actually they were losing jobs for China. Fortunately, I think in the end, the industry realized that, moving to China was certainly not a good economic move. But at some point, this was the biggest Mexican competitor. And I think as the U.S., we were losing by all these jobs, going further away because they were creating growth, far from us.
Our analysis shows also that there's very low import level into Mexico as well as into the U.S. And it's partially due to the logistics. But I think a really important point is that if we lose Mexico as a trading partner or an effectively cost-effective trade partner, what we're talking about here is it could be a very big win for China. They would probably be one of the next places to source the parts. So interestingly, the unintended consequences could end up being more imports from China if we actually undermine our relationship with Mexico.
And I would say, too, that one of the things our statistics don't do as the United States is we don't differentiate between aftermarket parts and OE parts. So we've been talking about this as a automotive supply chain right now, but there are a lot of parts that are brought into the United States and into Mexico that are aftermarket parts and service parts like that. So we don't know how to separate those, but just keep in mind when you look at those statistics, they include all parts. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I know I'm going to lose control of this real fast if I call on a reporter, but I'll go ahead and do it.
Okay, you're in essence saying that what the U.S. is expected to propose tomorrow is too drastic and too dramatic, and there's no way in hell that it would be able to be possible without costing jobs. Is there, however, some sort of an area where it's possible to improve U.S. content? Is there a percentage that you could increase? Is there something that you could do that is practical, that would be doable?
So since I have the podium, can I start and then have all the experts also? But one of the things that is consistently found the industry is saying is the rules of origin are not the tool to use to increase U.S. jobs and U.S. content. There are other tools, there are incentives, there are other ways we can do this. We can talk about, Xavier and Charles and Ian all mentioned, looking at new technologies, and those are the types of things, but not, but the rules of origin themselves are not the way to do this.
Just to add to that, I think one of the main points is, what is the purpose of a rule of origin? A rule of origin's purpose is to prevent free riders from enjoying the duty-free benefits of the free trade agreement without having made investments. We don't see a situation like that. As we just talked about in China, the trade with regards to China it's not as if China is a free rider on this. It's not benefiting from in any major way. So what we have is a situation where the rule of origin is being used as a tool to try to accomplish things that it's just not intended to in the first place.
Xavier, you and I have talked a lot, and I know in some of your recommendations you talk about how we can incentivize jobs. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. First, it's very simple, but and I think Jan was mentioning it. There's just labor availability. If you talk to the MEMA members, they're just concerned that they're creating jobs, but today they are starting to be in a situation where finding them becomes extremely difficult. It is not, by the way, specific to the automotive industry. Across industry, this is a concern that we're hearing more and more. And so, first of all, I think we need to find ways to better educate, to create apprenticeship systems, to make sure that we have and we can offer those jobs, especially as the content of cars is becoming in a way more sophisticated. We also need more sophisticated jobs. So that's I think should be our first objective. And I would say if it doesn't happen in the U.S., then it will happen in Mexico. It's all good, by the way, but I think we need to make sure that we can benefit from it. The second thing is I think we have to continue, pushing our car manufacturers and suppliers to provide more technology. My concern today, seriously, just being very open, is not whether we're competing with Mexico, is that the cars are being electric and the sales are all coming from Asia. Mexico is not the problem there. If we start replacing, engines, by batteries, there's no batteries in the U.S. We want to create jobs. Let's work on that. We have great technologies around automated vehicles. Japan is nowhere. Mexico is nowhere. This is not the competition. This is where actually, we need to make things happen. And it's going to be either the U.S. or it's going to be Germany. Why don't we use our competitive advantage to do that? What are the cars that the Germans are selling into the U.S.? Premium cars. We have Tesla. I'm not making any advertising here, but we have a Tesla which is maybe the best premium car manufacturer in the U.S. What are we doing to support Tesla's success globally? And again, it may be the right or the wrong partner, but these are the things we have to do to make a differentiation. Volkswagen, I still remember them talking about that, and Conti, I think you can comment on that. But at some point, they were saying there are parts for our engines that we just cannot find in NAFTA. We have to import them from Europe. This is where we can create jobs. And by the way, jobs that will not be competing with whatever low-cost country you can think of, the next generation that people are looking for in emerging geographies. I think this is how we can create jobs. And by the way, every time we've done that, we have succeeded. And this is where the U.S. economy today is strong, and we just have to provide and create more of these type of jobs.
Ian, do you want to add anything?
Xavier hit a number of points, and that's job creation, you can create all the jobs in the world, but you have to have the available workforce. One of the things that we've seen is we're growing jobs in a number of states throughout the Southeast and Middle America, and finding the availability of the workforce has become increasingly difficult. One of the things that I and some of my other automotive colleagues have been discussing here on Capitol Hill is that workforce development. That's something that's desperately needed. It's having the availability of our youngsters to either, whether it be into engineering or into manufacturing. We are at a severe disadvantage from some of our foreign competitors in having that availability. And so, again, I go back, create all the jobs you want, but we've got to have the available workforce to fill them. In terms of the availability of some of our raw materials, that's another thing that the U.S. can be at a shortage of. We talk about some of our intricate technologies that we have, one of which we didn't speak of that Continental has knowledge of, and that's tires. Having the availability for steel cord that's necessary in tire manufacturing is something that just isn't here in the United States. Rubber, natural or synthetic, another product, is unavailable here in the United States. We've got to import it, and we've got to have the tools in place that allow us to do that, so that we can make the technological tires available to the consumer at a cost-effective rate. Otherwise, we're just importing all the tires from foreign sources, and that is going against what the administration is trying to do, and that's create jobs. So we've got to be able to get those raw materials in so that we can fulfill all the jobs that we've promised to the state of Mississippi, to the state of South Carolina, and to the state of Illinois.
So I'm going to ask sort of two questions together, but this is, one of the things that's really important to manufacturers is regulatory certainty. And there's two provisions that we've heard about, talked about in the NAFTA renegotiations. One of them is a 5-year sunset provision that the administration has publicly said that they're very interested in pursuing. But the second one is, it seems to be that in the rules of origin, we're talking about a 2-year transition time for the auto industry. Let's talk a little bit about, what's necessary in manufacturing. I mean, is 2 years sufficient? And I realize it's not, but let's explain why it's not sufficient. Because I think a lot of people think 2 years is a long time. That should be sufficient. And then how do you see both that 2-year transition time in the rules of origin, and then secondly, the 5-year sunset provision affecting manufacturing decisions, manufacturing going forward?
Well, let me just start on that. The supply chain with Canada has been developed over the last 50 years. Actually, starting in 1964, 1965, the Auto Pact was established. So we basically had free trade with Canada, and our supply chains have been integrated since then. We've had 23 years of integration with Mexico. So we're talking about, highly integrated region. And then on top of that, we have a situation where for a car, concept to actually the car rolling out the factory door is a 4 or 5, sometimes 6-year process. So what we're talking about here is if there are these changes to the supply chains that have been in place for decades, on top of the fact that a 2-year time frame to make these kinds of changes to the supply chain is just unreasonable and unworkable, and especially when you have from products that take 5-year lead times, 5-6 year lead times just from concept to the end product. Ian,
Right. We've been working with this NAFTA agreement for roughly coming on 25 years here, and it's something that we continue to perfect our supply chain year after year. Eliminating it and expecting us to comply within 2 years, or amending it and expecting us to comply in 2 years is unreasonable. Even at 4 and 5 years would be difficult and costly. And would we comply? More than likely, because we're forced to. But that doesn't mean we create an optimum system. It would be suboptimal and at a price that would put in jeopardy any future investment, whether it be in technologies or in the workforce.
We're talking about tariffs for vehicles at 2.5% and for parts on average about 2.5%. So we're talking about increasing the cost of manufacturing in the United States when that, the threshold for bringing it in, importing it in is a 2.5% tariff. So we're looking at a situation where you could easily create with some of these proposals costs that are much higher than the 2.5%. So you're basically going to be incentivizing imports and disincentivizing U.S. production. Again, a really important unintended consequence that could come out of this.
And Xavier, I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to add is, we are in a way in a good situation where we've never been as high in the U.S. in terms of, automotive markets and supplier jobs. But every single plant is at full capacity, and many of them above full capacity. So a lot of suppliers and OEMs are working at 110, 120%, just because they know that at some point there will be a slight decline. And they want to make sure they're ready for that. Which means that today, in a way, reshoring manufacturing from existing plants in Mexico, for instance, to the US would require a new investment. The payback of a new investment in that industry is 15 to 20 years. So, any decision that can be taken, within 2 years is unrealistic. And then the administration knows that for many of those parts, there are, even when you have relocated and remanufactured, there's a validation process for most, safety parts, and just the validation process is 18 months. So it's just not feasible, and the result of that is nothing will change. It's just an added cost, and that's frankly the most likely scenario for most of the parts we have looked at. Is just added cost, and there's no particular reaction that can be expected neither for OEMs nor from suppliers.